It started with that faint mechanical hum, the kind that doesn't belong in a place built for silence. It was late, around 10:42 p.m., when the sound skimmed across the sky above my backyard. At first I thought it was a kid's new toy, one of those cheap plastic quadcopters you can buy at gas stations. But when that black speck stopped and hovered, dead still, right outside my bedroom window, I knew I wasn't dealing with curiosity. I was being watched. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. Because if you've ever had that moment where the hair on your neck stands up and you just know someone's eyes are on you, you'll understand exactly what came next. The next night it returned. Same altitude, same slow glide over my porch light. Red LEDs blinking like warning pulses in the dark. I stepped outside, pretending I didn't notice. I could almost feel the lens tracking me. I tossed a pebble its way. Pointless. The drone zipped off like it had been trained to dodge threats. On night 3, I didn't wave or ignore it. I waited. I set my camera on a tripod by the sliding glass door and positioned myself under the maple tree, air rifle cradled tight against my shoulder. Years in the Air Force taught me patience, and patience has a sound. It's the steady rhythm of your own heartbeat while you line up a shot. One squeeze, a single pop. The hum stuttered, then fell silent. The drone spiraled, clipped a branch, and slammed into the grass. I walked toward it slowly, flashlight cutting a tunnel through the dark. The wreckage wasn't some off-the-shelf gadget. It was professional. Carbon fiber frame, thermal lens, encrypted memory module. On its underside, a silver tag. Property of Willow Creek Homeowners Association. My HOA, my quiet little neighborhood of smiling lawn committees and Christmas decoration finds. That was the night I realized the people running this place weren't neighbors. They were operators. By sunrise, I'd already taken photos of every angle of the wreckage, logged serial numbers, and stored the evidence in a sealed container. Years of working federal contracts make you methodical. Chain of custody matters, even when the chain starts in your own backyard. At 9 a.m., I drove to the HOA office, the beige one behind the pool that always smelled like chlorine and paperwork. Inside, the president, Karen Whitman, was waiting. Mid-50s, fitness studio posture, the kind of confidence born from never being told no. She smiled the way politicians do before a press conference. "Mr. Allen, we heard there was an incident with one of our neighborhood security drones." She said, "security," like it was mercy. I set the crushed drone on her desk. "You mean the one violating FAA altitude restrictions and state privacy statutes?" I asked. Her smile didn't flicker. "Neighborhood safety initiative," she said. "Surveillance deters crime." "And monitors residents," I countered. "Without consent." She folded her hands. "We'll need that equipment back. Destroying association property is a serious offense." The arrogance in her tone clicked everything into place. This wasn't mismanagement. It was control, engineered and deliberate. I walked out without another word. That night, they sent reinforcements. 2 drones, circling like vultures. I recorded everything. The footage wasn't just intrusive, it was tactical. They paused over windows, hovered above driveways, followed heat signatures. By morning, HOA legal counsel had delivered a notice of civil action to my door. Destruction of association property, restitution demand $3,000. I laughed out loud. They'd just admitted ownership on paper. Evidence A. Still, beneath the anger was something colder. Resolve. They thought they could bury me under paperwork, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. My background in communications analysis wasn't just resume filler. It meant I understood how data moves, how surveillance networks talk to each other, and more importantly, how to make them confess. I spent the next 48 hours dissecting the fallen drone piece by piece on my kitchen table. Inside its camera module, I found a micro SD card. 6 months of footage, neatly time-stamped and cataloged by address. Every home in Willow Creek. Yards, porches, garages, even glimpses through windows. Every single resident under watch. The pattern was military-grade surveillance with none of the oversight. That was my first open loop. I didn't yet know how deep it went, only that Karen Whitman's little empire was hiding behind a layer of suburban normalcy, polished to perfection. The moment I saw my own porch labeled Subject Delta 12, the game changed. I backed up the files to 3 separate encrypted drives and stored them off-site. Then I went silent. No arguments at meetings, no posts on the neighborhood forum, nothing. To them, silence would look like defeat. To me, it was camouflage. Because if Karen thought she'd broken me, she'd relax just enough for me to catch her off guard. That was the first week. By the second, I was tracing purchase orders through open-source vendor databases. The drones came from a tech supplier 2 towns over. The buyer? Willow Creek HOA, signed by Karen Whitman herself. Payment? Cash. No permits, no data protection filings, no insurance, completely off the legal grid. When I confronted the supplier in person, posing as a potential customer, the clerk recognized the name instantly. "Those HOA folks," he said, "bought 8 of those things, said they were for community watch enforcement. Creepy, right?" He laughed. I didn't. I left with a copy of the invoice. At home, I cataloged everything. Invoice number, serial logs, vendor ID, evidence B. Every discovery pulled another thread. Cameras newly installed under eaves, motion sensors hidden behind decorative shrubs. It wasn't just drones. It was an integrated surveillance lattice blanketing the neighborhood. And no one had consented. I reached out quietly to a few residents I trusted. A retired teacher, a single mom across the street. Both had stories. Strange mail tampered with, unknown cars idling, inspectors showing up unannounced. When I showed them the footage, their faces drained of color. "They can't do this," the teacher whispered. "It's illegal." She was right. It violated state privacy statutes, FCC surveillance limits, and basic human decency. That's when I made my move. I didn't dump the footage online. That would make it sensational, not surgical. Instead, I sent encrypted copies to an investigative journalist specializing in privacy law. No name attached, just proof. 2 days later, everything detonated. By the time the story hit local news, Willow Creek was on fire, not literally, but reputationally. News vans parked along the cul-de-sac, reporters shouting questions as HOA board members scurried to their cars. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact were now clustered in small groups whispering, frightened by what they'd seen. They weren't just discovering hidden cameras. They were realizing they'd been living under surveillance for months. My name wasn't public yet, but everyone could feel where the story was pointing. That was fine with me. Staying quiet kept me 2 steps ahead of HOA Karen and her legal storm. I'd learned that lesson long before I moved into this neighborhood, when silence, discipline, and evidence meant survival. Back when I served in the Air Force, my world revolved around signals, radio intercepts, encrypted transmissions, and data patterns that exposed intentions before the enemy acted. That discipline never leaves you. When I left the military, I went into private consulting for the Federal Communications Compliance Office, the agency that ensures no one misuses surveillance technology without authorization. Ironically, I'd spent years auditing corporations for the same violations my own HOA had just committed. I'd seen federal agencies dismantle multi-million-dollar operations for lesser offenses. The difference was that those offenders wore suits, not pastel polos. That irony wasn't lost on me as I stood at my kitchen table staring at the 8 recovered drone serial numbers burned into my notebook. HOA. Karen had no idea that she hadn't just picked a fight with a resident. She'd declared war on a man trained to dismantle surveillance networks for a living. I filed my documentation like a case file. Incident logs, drone wreckage photos, and witness statements from the few brave neighbors who trusted me. I made sure every timestamp was intact, every image authenticated. I knew that in any legal battle, evidence was the oxygen that kept your case alive. But more than that, I knew how predators like Karen operated. She'd built her power on fear, paper fines, vague bylaws, and the threat of community penalties. It was the same control architecture used by authoritarian systems worldwide, scaled down to cul-de-sac size. She mistook silence for weakness and compliance for consent. That was her first miscalculation. The night after the story broke, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, the air cold enough to fog each breath. Across the lake, lights flickered inside Karen's house. The blinds were drawn tight, the way guilty people hide when they can't hide the truth anymore. I could almost picture her pacing with that restless arrogance, the same posture she wore when she lectured residents about lawn colors or mailbox standards. But now the world outside her gated comfort zone was watching her. And that's when I understood something about power. It's only terrifying when it's unchallenged. Once exposed, it turns brittle. The next morning I went to work quietly. Not my old federal office, those contracts were behind me, but my personal investigation. I dug deeper into the HOA's internal structure, the treasurer's name, the legal counsel, and their insurance underwriters. What I discovered wasn't just mismanagement, it was organized deception. Karen had been funneling HOA funds into security initiatives listed as community safety upgrades. The expense reports were padded, vague, and always approved without a member vote. She had created a private surveillance network and disguised it as neighborhood beautification. It was genius in its simplicity and criminal in its execution. Each purchase had her signature, proof of direct authorization. But documentation alone wasn't enough. I needed to understand the network. Each drone transmitted to a local server, probably housed in the HOA's office behind the pool. I knew that system would contain everything: flight logs, video archives, maybe even the metadata linking which board member requested which flight. Accessing it would be risky, but I wasn't breaking in. I was preparing a lawful subpoena trail. I contacted an old colleague, a digital forensics expert now working under federal contract. I explained the situation in careful terms: civilian surveillance under false authority. He didn't even hesitate. "You've got violations of Title 18, Section 2511, interception of communications without consent," he said. "If what you're saying checks out, that HOA's toast." His confidence was fuel. That night, the intimidation began to ramp up. Anonymous notes appeared in my mailbox, typed, unsigned, threatening. "Stop before it gets worse." My security cameras caught shadow figures near my driveway at 2 a.m., their faces hidden under hoodies. It didn't scare me. It confirmed I was getting close. I filed police reports for everything, maintaining the same cold professionalism I used to when drafting intelligence summaries. Every report was a nail tightening the lid on Karen's coffin. She thought fear would paralyze me, but all it did was remind me of training. When cornered, document everything. Act only when you have the upper hand. When the HOA filed their formal lawsuit, accusing me of destroying property and violating community harmony, I smiled reading the complaint. It was filled with vague legal threats and baseless jargon, obvious intimidation. What they didn't realize was that discovery would be their undoing. Once their servers were subpoenaed, Every byte of footage they'd stored would become part of the public record. I contacted a property rights attorney named Catherine Bennett, known for dismantling overreaching HOAs. I emailed her the evidence package, flight records, serial traces, and the cash purchase invoice signed by Karen Whitman. It took her less than an hour to respond. "Mr. Allen," she wrote, "what you have here is a civil suit waiting to flip into a criminal investigation." The transformation of my mindset was immediate. This wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. They'd stolen privacy, manipulated authority, and weaponized bureaucracy. But I wasn't fighting for vengeance. I was fighting to make sure no one else in this neighborhood would ever look out their window and wonder who was watching. The more I built my case, the more I understood that Karen's empire wasn't about security. It was about control. She wanted compliance, obedience, and fear. And she was about to learn that there's a special kind of fury reserved for those who weaponize law against the innocent. The deeper I looked, the more I saw how carefully HOA Karen had built her throne. Her authority wasn't official. It was psychological. Every piece of paper, every bylaw, every friendly reminder letter was designed to sound lawful enough that no one dared to question it. The board members weren't partners. They were loyal subordinates who'd traded backbone for proximity to power. Karen ran her meetings like a general disguised in designer heels, her voice dripping with false patience as she told residents, "We all must do our part to keep Willow Creek safe." But the word safe was just camouflage for control. Her private circle, 3 board members and 1 attorney, approved everything without a single community vote. To the outside world, she was a model of leadership. To anyone who pushed back, she was a warden with a clipboard. I started digging into her background. Her real name was Karen Whitman, age 54, a former city zoning administrator with a history of ethics complaints that somehow disappeared before she ran for HOA president. Public records showed she'd been forced out of her old job after procedural discrepancies involving permit approvals. Translation: she'd learned how to weaponize rules. It made perfect sense. In the hands of someone like her, bylaws became weapons sharper than any knife. Each line was a loophole, each fine a form of coercion. I could almost respect the precision of her manipulation. Almost. She'd built an empire not by breaking the law, but by bending it until it screamed. At the next board meeting, I attended quietly, camera recording discreetly from my pocket. The fluorescent lights flickered as Karen presided over the crowd like a monarch addressing peasants. "Our security initiative," she said, smiling just enough to appear benevolent, "has drastically reduced suspicious activity in the neighborhood." I could see the unease ripple across the room. No one dared to ask how she defined suspicious. When one elderly resident timidly raised her hand to ask about privacy, Karen's tone hardened. "If you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about." It was a sentence I'd heard too many times in too many countries where freedom was a rumor. That was her tell. Arrogance disguised as justification. She was no longer pretending to protect anyone. She was maintaining control. After the meeting, I followed the money. The HOA's financial reports, what little was publicly available, listed security expenditures under a shell account managed by a third-party vendor called Safe Sky Solutions, LLC. On paper, it was a local contractor. In reality, it was a company registered to an address that didn't exist. Fake invoices, forged signatures, and digital transfers routed through personal accounts tied to Karen's relatives. She wasn't just violating privacy laws, she was laundering community dues to fund her private spy network. The deeper I traced it, the more obvious it became that this wasn't a simple HOA overreach. It was corporate corruption hidden behind picket fences and flower beds. My attorney, Catherine Bennett, reviewed the documents with the same calm intensity I'd seen in federal agents during debriefings. "She's running this like a small-town cartel," Catherine said, her pen tapping the invoice header. The second we subpoena those bank statements, she'll panic. Keep documenting everything, but don't confront her yet. Let her make the next mistake." I knew she was right. Cornering someone like Karen too early only made them more dangerous, and I could feel her watching me now. Not through drones this time, but through the eyes of fearful neighbors she'd groomed into informants. Every sideways glance, every cold nod at the mailbox was a reminder. She still thought she was untouchable. But power, that fragile, can't survive exposure. It needs secrecy, like fire needs oxygen. I decided to choke it out slowly. First, I leaked small pieces of information anonymously to local reporters, details that hinted at something bigger. A resident claiming the HOA used drones without consent. A source mentioning misuse of funds. Each drop of truth spread faster than Karen could contain it. By the time she tried to issue a statement calling the claims unfounded rumors, the public had already chosen a side. And it wasn't hers. That night, a black SUV idled, at the end of my street again. Headlights off, engine low, just watching. The intimidation was obvious, amateur even. I didn't react. Instead, I emailed Catherine the plate number, then went back inside and poured another cup of coffee. Let them watch. Every second they wasted trying to scare me was another second I spent tightening the noose legally. Karen thought she was the queen of this board, but what she didn't realize was that her castle was made of paper. And I had the matchbook. As I prepared the next phase of my plan, I went through the HOA's charter again and noticed something small but explosive. The clause authorizing surveillance for safety required a supermajority vote by residents. That vote had never happened. She'd forged authority she didn't have. That was the crack I needed. I printed everything. The invoices, the bylaw violation, the purchase orders, and stored copies off-site. The next morning I called my contact at the Federal Communications Compliance Office, the same agency I once worked for. I didn't need to drop my credentials. My tone alone carried the weight of someone who understood the law better than the violators ever could. "You'll want to look into Willow Creek HOA," I said. "Possible violations of Section 2511 and unauthorized data collection under state surveillance statutes." The man on the other end went quiet for a moment before replying, "You've just made my week." By the time the county investigators arrived, Karen's polished mask was cracking. She called another emergency meeting, desperate to reclaim control. I sat in the back row, arms crossed, watching her unravel. "Certain parties," she said, her voice trembling just slightly, "have been spreading misinformation about our community programs." The word misinformation landed like a confession. I didn't need to say a word. The room did the rest. Murmurs spread. People who once obeyed her were now whispering, doubting, asking questions. For the first time, she wasn't dictating the conversation, she was drowning in it. She tried to stare me down, but I met her gaze without blinking. Authority isn't about volume, it's about composure. And in that moment, she saw something she couldn't manipulate. A man who had stopped fearing her. The silence between us was brief but heavy, the kind that shifts power permanently. I could see the realization flicker behind her eyes. She'd lost control of the narrative, and once that happens, everything else collapses. Once the county investigators confirmed they were reviewing the HOA's finances, I knew the real war had shifted from front lawns to hard drives. I spent entire nights sitting at my desk, light from the monitor bouncing off the drone wreckage beside me, cross-referencing timestamps, invoices, and audio logs. Every discovery bled into the next. The more data I connected, the more I understood how deep Karen's operation ran. She wasn't just violating bylaws. She had built a full surveillance network under the HOA's letterhead. Each flight path recorded, each resident indexed, each camera linked to a cloud repository registered under her personal administrative ID. It was an entire architecture of control, disguised as a neighborhood improvement plan. I started reconstructing the system. Each drone had an identifier embedded in its firmware, traces of access pings back to a local network I hadn't yet uncovered. It wasn't random. The frequency intervals matched the signal strength from the HOA office router. Every time a drone flew over a house, the data synced to that router, time-stamped under encrypted folders named Community Compliance Records. It wasn't amateur work. It was calculated and systematic. That told me she hadn't done this alone. Someone with moderate IT background, maybe one of the board members, had set up the infrastructure. I printed packet captures, decoded fragments of transmission logs, and stored everything in labeled evidence envelopes. Catherine, my attorney, reviewed each file like a surgeon reading X-rays. "This isn't surveillance," she said quietly. "It's espionage. She's been intercepting private signals, recording without consent, and archiving them off-site. That's felony level under Title 18. Her calm tone carried more weight than any threat. "We'll start with a preservation order. Once the judge signs it, the HOA can't delete anything." 2 days later, I filed the motion through her office. The court approved it in less than 24 hours. Karen had just lost her ability to erase the past. That night, I watched from my window as 2 men entered the HOA building after dark. They carried duffel bags, moving fast and nervous, lights flickering inside. I filmed everything. At 2:17 a.m., they left carrying hard drives wrapped in towels. I didn't confront them. I sent the footage to Catherine instead. The next morning, investigators arrived with a county warrant. The office was locked, but the back window showed signs of forced entry. The files were gone, but the timing was enough to prove obstruction. Karen had crossed into criminal territory, and there was no walking back. While the authorities worked their case, I kept digging. My background in communications analysis wasn't just a title. It was muscle memory. I used spectral scans to detect residual signals from the drones that hadn't been confiscated yet. The network was still alive, though weaker, running on a secondary access point routed through a private Wi-Fi hub located near Karen's home. I triangulated the signal using a directional receiver, tracing it straight to her property line. When I confronted her in daylight, she didn't deny it. She smiled that brittle smile again and said, "You're obsessed, Mr. Allen. Maybe you should focus on your own compliance before accusing others." "Funny," I said, "because the FCC doesn't call it obsession. They call it evidence." Her expression flickered, just for a second. That second told me everything. She was scared, but too proud to admit it. Later that week, Catherine called with an update. "Federal interest is confirmed," she said. "The Communications Compliance Office has requested your data logs. They're opening a joint case with state prosecutors. You've officially triggered a multi-agency investigation." I didn't speak for a few seconds. All those nights documenting, tracing, and cross-referencing had finally broken through the bureaucracy. "They're pulling every permit, every financial transfer, every digital record tied to that HOA," she continued. "When they're done, she won't be facing fines. She'll be facing charges." Karen must have sensed the ground shifting, because the next day she distributed a letter to all residents claiming the safety initiative had been misinterpreted. She blamed a former contractor for improper drone use and promised to refund fees. It was a classic deflection, an attempt to control damage before it burned out of her hands. But it was too late. The journalist I'd worked with published a follow-up story titled "Inside the Willow Creek Surveillance Scandal." The HOA that watched its residents. The piece went viral. Phones rang non-stop. News vans camped outside her home. Federal agents arrived within days to seize remaining hardware. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't silent out of fear. It was silent because the illusion had shattered. The same residents who once bowed to her authority now watched her walk to her car, flanked by investigators, her once perfect confidence stripped away. I stood on my porch and thought about every open loop in this story. The first drone hum, the fake smile, the lawsuits, the threats, and realized we were closing them one by one. There was no satisfaction yet, only momentum. Karen's empire had been built on digital lies and community ignorance, but what she hadn't calculated was what happens when someone fights back with discipline, precision, and proof. I wasn't the loudest man in the room, but I was the last one standing with receipts. And when those receipts turned into subpoenas, she finally understood the difference between power and permission. The morning the subpoenas were served, you could feel the tension pulsing through the neighborhood like static before a storm. People whispered near mailboxes, phone calls cut short when I walked by, and Karen's usual morning routine, her brisk power walk around the cul-de-sac, had disappeared entirely. The empire she built from manipulation was finally crumbling, but that didn't mean she'd go quietly. When a person like her feels the leash tighten, they bite. I woke up to a stack of new fines taped to my door, each one more absurd than the last. Violation of curb aesthetics, non-compliant mailbox design, unauthorized security lighting. They weren't enforcement. They were retaliation, pure and simple. I didn't remove them. I documented every single one, time-stamped the photos, and sent them straight to Catherine. "She's panicking," my attorney said. "Let her bury herself. Every petty action strengthens our case." But Karen wasn't just throwing paperwork at me. She was trying to rewrite the narrative. The HOA's official newsletter released an urgent community notice, accusing an unnamed resident of spreading misinformation to the media and causing reputational harm. I didn't need to guess who the unnamed resident was. The piece ended with her favorite phrase, "Willow Creek stands for unity, not division." The hypocrisy almost made me laugh. This wasn't unity. It was tyranny wrapped in polite suburban diction. That evening, a black SUV reappeared near my driveway, engine idling. I walked out calmly, phone in hand, camera rolling. The window rolled down an inch. A male voice called out, "You really should stop making this worse for yourself." I didn't answer. I just smiled, walked around the vehicle, and filmed the license plate. Within 20 minutes, the footage was on a secure drive. I sent a copy to the county investigator and another to Catherine. You could almost hear Karen's desperation leaking through her tactics. She wanted to scare me into submission, but fear had lost its power weeks ago. 2 days later, the HOA hosted what they called a transparency meeting. It was anything but. The folding tables were lined with bottled water and carefully stacked agendas. Karen stood at the front, wearing her favorite red blazer, the color of command, or so she thought. Her voice cracked slightly as she began reading prepared statements about false accusations and malicious reporting. The crowd wasn't buying it. When one resident asked if the drones were registered with the FAA, Karen dodged the question. Another asked why the HOA's financial disclosures showed cash withdrawals without board approval. She snapped, "You wouldn't understand the complexities of managing community security." That sentence sealed her fate. It was the arrogance, the entitlement, the belief that she was untouchable even as the ground gave way beneath her. I stayed in the back, recording. My goal wasn't to humiliate her, it was to document the truth in real time. But the humiliation came naturally. A man in his 70s stood up and shouted, "My daughter was recorded through her window. You call that security?" The room erupted. Shouts, gasps, people demanding answers. Karen tried to restore order by banging a gavel against the table, but the noise only drowned her authority further. Her kingdom had turned on her. The next morning, every local news station ran the footage. Headlines spread across screens. HOA meeting erupts over drone scandal. By noon, the county commissioner released a statement confirming a formal criminal investigation into Willow Creek HOA. That was the moment Karen realized she was no longer fighting a neighbor. She was fighting the law. Still, she tried one last desperate move. Her lawyer sent Catherine an offer. Drop all claims, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and restore harmony to the community in exchange for a quiet settlement. Catherine forwarded me the email with a single note. "You ready to end this properly?" I replied, "I didn't come this far to settle." The following week, subpoenas turned into search warrants. Investigators raided the HOA office, seizing computers, filing cabinets, and security logs. Karen stood outside with crossed arms and sunglasses, trying to look defiant. But the camera crews captured everything, the same cameras she once used to monitor everyone else. One reporter asked, "Mrs. Whitman, were you aware that residents' private areas were being recorded?" Her jaw clenched. No comment. The footage went viral by evening. Neighbors who once ignored me now stopped to shake my hand. One woman said, "We didn't know how deep it went. Thank you for not backing down." It wasn't gratitude I wanted. It was awareness. For months, we'd all lived under her invisible control, mistaking fear for peace. Now, people were starting to understand the difference. But Karen wasn't finished yet. 2 nights after the raid, someone slashed my tires and smashed my porch light. The message was clear, and so was my response. I called the sheriff, filed another report, and added the footage from my remaining cameras to the growing pile of evidence. The next day, investigators found matching footprints near Karen's backyard gate. The pattern matched a pair of boots her husband wore publicly at every meeting. It was amateur hour retaliation, and it handed the prosecutors another layer of obstruction. When the next round of court documents arrived, I realized we were entering the endgame. Karen was now facing charges for illegal surveillance, data tampering, and obstruction of justice. Her once loyal board members began flipping, trading information for reduced liability. The empire she built on fear was devouring itself. I remember standing in my driveway the morning after her arrest warrant went public. The air was cold, the street quiet. The hum that once haunted the nights was gone. Across the road, neighbors were talking again, voices soft but hopeful. For the first time in months, I felt peace that wasn't defensive. It was earned. The power structure had finally cracked, and the light was spilling through. The story that started with a drone in the dark had become something bigger, a symbol of what happens when one person refuses to accept intimidation as law. Karen had underestimated her target. She thought she was fighting a homeowner. What she got was an investigator with a federal memory and a reason to fight back. The days following the confrontation were a blur of quiet precision. The HOA's walls of denial had collapsed, and the investigation had widened far beyond local jurisdiction. Federal agents from the Communications Compliance Office and the state's Department of Justice were now working in tandem, combing through digital trails and financial logs like vultures on a carcass. Karen's once pristine reputation had disintegrated in the national press. She was no longer HOA president of Willow Creek. She was the drone queen, the woman accused of running a suburban surveillance network without consent. And yet, despite everything, she still believed she could control the outcome. That delusion was the final thing I intended to strip away. Catherine and I met at her downtown office, the same one where she'd first reviewed my evidence months ago. This time there were boxes stacked against the wall. Transcripts, depositions, witness statements, bank records, and flight data logs. She looked up from her desk with a small, tight smile. They found over 70 hours of footage tied directly to her admin account. Every drone sync was authenticated by her digital signature, It's game over." I nodded, the weight of months of work settling into something quieter than relief. "Let's make it official," I said. She slid a document across the table, a civil action naming the Willow Creek HOA and Karen Whitman personally for invasion of privacy, data theft, and harassment. It wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a declaration that their reign had ended. The trial preparation began immediately. Catherine worked like a tactician, assembling a legal strike team that treated every clause of the HOA charter like enemy terrain. I supplied the intelligence, network architecture, data pathways, timestamps, and verified recordings. Together we built a case that didn't just expose misconduct, it turned it into a case study for reform. "She thought she was above the law," Catherine said during one late-night session. "Now she's going to be the precedent every HOA president fears." Word spread fast. Other residents began filing complaints too, emboldened by what they'd seen. One man discovered cameras hidden inside the decorative lanterns near the community pool. A young mother found audio bugs wired into her porch lights. The evidence was overwhelming. Each new discovery added weight to the prosecution, crushing any remaining doubt that this had ever been about safety. It was control, disguised, systematic, and criminal. The final nail came when the HOA's treasurer turned state witness, handing over Karen's private ledger detailing unreported payments labeled as community surveillance enhancement. Those records showed she'd siphoned over $70,000 from HOA funds for her drone program. When the indictment came down, it was everything we'd worked for. 8 felony counts: illegal surveillance, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and wiretapping violations, along with multiple civil claims from residents. Karen's mugshot hit every major network within hours. The woman who once held neighborhood barbecues and boasted about keeping the community safe was now the face of one of the most invasive privacy scandals in the state. I watched the news from my living room, coffee in hand, as the anchor read her charges with clinical precision. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was restoration. The kind that doesn't come with cheers, only silence that finally feels right. But the legal fight wasn't finished. Her defense team tried to frame her actions as a community misunderstanding, claiming she'd acted with good intentions. Catherine dismantled that argument in one sentence. Intent doesn't erase illegality. We presented the drone metadata, the forged invoices, the HOA's altered financial records, and the footage showing Karen personally supervising the installation of hidden cameras. Every time her lawyer objected, the judge overruled. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavier with each exhibit, each revelation. The jury didn't need convincing. They needed closure. On the final day of testimony, the prosecution played the video I'd found on the anonymous USB, the one showing Karen and her board discussing flagging potential whistleblowers. The courtroom fell silent. Her voice filled the room, sharp and calculating, saying my name, listing troublesome residents to monitor. I watched her expression twist, her hands tightening on the table. There it was, the mask finally breaking in public. The woman who ruled a neighborhood through fear was now exposed in front of the law she thought she controlled. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all major counts, sentencing deferred pending restitution hearings. Karen's bail revoked after evidence showed she'd attempted to destroy additional files before her arrest. The HOA was dissolved under emergency state supervision, and a reformation committee was appointed to rebuild the community under transparent bylaws. The moment the judge's gavel fell, the entire courtroom exhaled. Months of fear and intimidation ended with one sound. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, microphones flashing. I gave a single statement. Privacy isn't a privilege, it's a right, and in Willow Creek we're taking it back. I didn't wait for follow-up questions. The cameras could have their headlines. I had my piece. That night, I drove back to the neighborhood. The houses looked different now. Calmer, real, human. Children played on the sidewalks again, their laughter replacing the hum that used to haunt the nights. The HOA office was dark, the sign removed, the windows boarded. Across the lake, Karen's house sat empty, its curtains drawn. I parked by the curb and sat in silence, watching the reflection of moonlight ripple on the water. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I didn't feel watched. I felt free. Catherine called me just before midnight. "The Attorney General's office wants to use the Willow Creek case as precedent," she said. "You've just rewritten how surveillance violations are prosecuted under private organizations." I let out a quiet breath. "Good," I replied. "Let's make sure no one forgets how this started, with a drone that flew too close to the wrong house." 3 months later, Willow Creek was unrecognizable. Gone were the clipped hedges that hid cameras, the flyers warning of mandatory compliance, the tight-lipped neighbors too afraid to look each other in the eye. In their place was something new. Laughter, openness, the sound of doors slamming not from paranoia, but from life returning. The air didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt clean. Even the lake seemed brighter, the reflection of the sun stretching across the water like a quiet apology for what this place had endured. For the first time in years, the silence meant peace, not fear. Karen Whitman was gone, serving her sentence in a federal facility an hour north of the county line. Her name had become a cautionary tale. She'd spent decades believing she could manipulate rules to fit her will, but even the sharpest manipulator forgets one truth. Paper trails don't lie. Her trial had rewritten more than her story. It had rewritten the law. The precedent she left behind would change how HOAs operated across the state. Every community board now faced mandatory transparency audits, privacy disclosures, and third-party oversight. The watchdogs were finally being watched. I walked through the neighborhood early one morning as dew clung to the grass, my footsteps echoing against the quiet. People waved. Some stopped to talk. "You really changed things," one older man said, leaning against his fence. "We were afraid to even question her before. Guess we all needed someone to remind us the rules go both ways." I nodded, because that was all there was to say. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about forcing accountability back into a place that had forgotten it. For months, she had used power as a weapon, and now power belonged to the people again. The new HOA board was different, transparent, democratic, and humbled. Meetings were open, minutes publicly posted, finances accessible to every resident. Catherine had helped draft the Reformation Charter herself, embedding clauses that prevented unilateral authority, hidden budgets, and any form of unauthorized surveillance. "If she hadn't gone this far," Catherine said during one of our review sessions, "no one would have known how bad the system could get. You didn't just end her regime, you exposed a loophole big enough to swallow freedom." Her words lingered with me, because that was the real victory. It wasn't about punishment, it was about prevention. When the state attorney general officially closed the case, I received a letter in the mail, simple, typed, and precise. It confirmed full restitution for all victims, reimbursement of fines, and acknowledgement of unlawful surveillance. At the bottom was one line that made me pause. Case file 1123, Allen v. Willow Creek HOA, now archived under state precedent law. My name was part of history, not because I'd sought it, but because I'd refused to stay silent. I placed the letter inside the old ammunition box where I'd kept every piece of evidence, then sealed it shut. My grandfather used to say the strongest walls aren't made of brick, they're made of truth. Now I understood what he meant. By summer, the community transformed completely. The old HOA office was turned into a community garden. The walls that once held servers and data racks now supported ivy and tomato vines. The same residents who once avoided me were now working side by side, planting, laughing, rebuilding. At the center stood a small plaque the county had installed. In honor of those who stood against unlawful authority and reclaimed their right to privacy. My name was among the others etched into it, but I never looked at it for long. I didn't need recognition. The sight of kids running freely under the open sky was enough. Karen's mansion across the lake was auctioned and bought by a young family with 2 children. They replaced her iron gates with white fencing and filled the yard with toys. I drove by once, and the sound of laughter drifted through the air. It felt poetic, her fortress of control becoming someone else's playground of innocence. The past had been exorcised. The neighborhood had healed. Catherine called again a few weeks later. "They want you to testify at the legislative hearing," she said. "HOA reform bill. They're naming it the Allen Act." I laughed softly. "Fitting," I said. "But I'll only do it if we call it what it really is, a reminder." When the day came, I stood in front of the committee and told them everything, from the first hum of that drone to the final knock of the gavel. I didn't talk about vengeance or heroism. I talked about boundaries, about how power without oversight always finds ways to abuse itself. Freedom doesn't die in dictatorships, I told them. It dies in neighborhoods where people stop asking questions. When I left the Capitol that afternoon, the sky broke open with rain, heavy and cleansing. I stood outside for a while, letting it fall across my face. The weight I'd carried since that first night lifted with each drop. The fight was over, but the mission had become something greater, a quiet promise to never let fear disguise itself as order again. That evening, I returned to my cabin. The sun dipped low, the lake a mirror of fading gold. I stood on my porch, the same spot where this all began, and listened. No hum, no buzz, just the gentle rhythm of nature reclaiming what had been taken from it. I opened the ammunition box one last time and placed the final article inside, a printed headline that read, "State passes HOA surveillance reform bill after Willow Creek scandal." Then I closed it for good. Peace doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the spaces left after chaos. That night, as the sky turned to ash and stars blinked to life, I knew Willow Creek was finally free. The watchers were gone, and the watched were no longer afraid.